I'm Jamie Douglas Hamilton, and I'm the 16th great uncle of James Douglas, who was the founding father of the Black Douglas clan. So the story of James Douglas is one of the least known in Scottish history, but it's one of the most important, because without James Douglas fighting beside Bruce, they probably wouldn't have won the Wars of Independence. The story all started with his father, William the Hardy. He was a minor noble at the time, and he was captured by the English 3 times, but he was the first noble to fight alongside William Wallace, getting many more to rally behind his cause. He was captured in Berwick upon Tweed when Longshanks, the most ruthless king on the throne, sent his army up to Berwick to show the Scots what he was prepared to do to the country. For 3 days and 3 nights, he massacred the town, burning people inside the houses. Anyone who came out was killed, and he spared not even women, children. And on the 3rd day, he only stopped when he cut a pregnant woman's, when he saw the womb of a pregnant woman being cut open as a baby was hit off the ground. And that's when he said enough was enough. William the Hardy was then taken down to the Tower of London, where a year later he was murdered. His son, James, was sent with Bishop Lamberton over to France to escape the wrath of the English. All their lands were then confiscated and given to Clifford at the time, and so he was a disinherited, living in France, destitute. So the history we've always been fascinated in the family history. When I first heard about the story when I was a child, I almost didn't believe that this had happened, and it was so little reported or so little known. We knew about Robert the Bruce, we knew about William Wallace. No one talked about James of Douglas in the same way. He fought 57 battles, of which he won. 4 of these battles were the same size as Bannockburn that he fought in England. When Mel Gibson made the famous film Braveheart, they took the name from Sir James of Douglas, Braveheart, the brave heart of the king, and that was a name for Douglas and Bruce. His campaign all the way down to York and Humber, that was taken up, that was by James of Douglas. The famous film Braveheart with Mel Gibson was actually the name taken from James of Douglas. He was taking the brave heart of the king in his casket to go to fight in a crusade. It was nothing to do with William Wallace. So much of that story in Braveheart was attributed to James of Douglas. The story focused on the king, Robert the Bruce, rather than his knights. There have been a lot of books written about them, but it has never been told in film until Outlaw King. That was the first time the story had been told. So the story meant that James of Douglas transformed the fortunes of the Douglas family. Before then, they were minor nobility. After James of Douglas, Selkirk Forest, Jedburgh, the entire east, middle and west marches from Dumfries and Galloway were then all controlled and owned by the Douglas clan, who were the warriors fighting the English for over a century and a half as they would come up through England, and they were the protectors of the realm. But James Douglas was not the most powerful Douglas. Archibald the Grim, his illegitimate son, was the most powerful, who put the black back into the Black Douglas. He used to wield a sword over 6 feet high, 6 feet long, and cut through. Yeah, sorry, I'll rephrase that.
The son of James.
Yeah, it's the son of. He was born the same year that James Douglas died. So it happened.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah.
Please, about the son. Yeah. So that not only James Douglas but also.
So James Douglas had an illegitimate son, who was later called Archibald the Grim, and Archibald put the black back into the Black Douglas. Wielding a sword that was over 6 feet long, he cut through almost everyone he went in contact with, and he was the protector of a realm and guardian of Scotland. The Douglases had never had more power until their Archibald the Grim. The story of the Douglases has always been fascinating, but it's one of great sadness as well, because only 130 years after James Douglas died, the Douglas clan went from being the most powerful in Scotland to being expanded, and many of them going to Sweden after that point. They became too powerful and too much of a threat to the King of Scotland. And some of the worst, there was one story where the two Douglas earls, Douglas sons, were invited to Edinburgh Castle to pay homage to the King. When they were there for 2 days, speaking to the King, until they were at the black dinner, a bull's head was taken in, and that was a sign they were going to get murdered. They were then taken out to the courtyard where they were stabbed to death, and that was one of the inspirations behind Game of Thrones. So the Black Dinner was one of the inspirations behind Game of Thrones, at the Red Wedding, and later on, the Douglases and the Hamiltons combined. And that's where you have Douglas Hamilton, which is, we'll probably stay off, if we keep it to James Douglas. But what I was going to say was what I really want to talk about was William Hardy, France coming back, his campaign of Bruce, Methven, when all hope was lost, how he took back. Then Bannockburn, how he chased the English all the way he chased Edward II all the way to Dunbar Castle, where he ran his horse to death, and they didn't even have time at one stage to even stop for water. They had to keep on going. That's and that was after they were outnumbered 4-1. So, and then his campaigns in England. So those are things that very, very few people know. And there's I don't know if you've seen the book I Am Davis, all about the Black Douglas. James Douglas had a very hard upbringing. He was sent to France as his father was murdered, trying to protect Scotland. And he was ruthlessly murdered, as were the Scottish people, ruthlessly kept under control. And it was during that time in France where he was completely destitute, and he had no land back in Scotland. And then in 1306, he returned to Scotland with Bishop Lamberton. And at the time, Edward I had surrounded and laid siege to Stirling Castle. And he had asked to see Edward I for a meeting to ask for his land back. When he heard it was James Douglas who had come to see him, he said, "He is a son of a traitor, he must leave at once." And before he could do anything else, Bishop Lamberton made sure he left. What Edward I did not realise, he was known as the Hammer of the Scots, yet he had just told the future Hammer of English to leave. So I'll say that again. So when Edward I told James Douglas that he must leave at once and he is the son of a traitor and lands get forfeited from traitors and will never go back to him, he had the king. Sorry, I'll say the last bit. What Edward I didn't realise, the Hammer of the Scots, is he had just rebuked. James Douglas grew up destitute in France. He'd seen his father being murdered. He'd seen Scotland being ransacked by the English. His stepmother was destitute in complete poverty, and he was angry. He was angry of what happened, and he came back to beg for his lands. And when Longshanks realised who he was, he said, "He is the son of a traitor. He must leave at once." But what he didn't realise is he had just told that to the future hammer of the English. Robert the Bruce had killed Comyn at the other contender for the Scottish throne at the altar. And he always felt guilty for doing this. And that's why he would always rather that his heart was taken to Jerusalem and would fight in the Crusades. But when Sir James of Douglas died in Tiber in his last battle, the heart came back along with Sir James of Douglas's bones. And that's where it's now remains in Melrose Abbey. James of Douglas was Bruce's most loyal companion. He was there from the Battle of Methven when there was no hope. When all hope had been lost, he was the one who turned it around when he took over Douglas Castle. Before that, I'll go. So the campaign had been going disastrously for Bruce. Battle of Methven, he had hardly escaped with his life. The few supporters he had at that time were even fewer. The want of horses went to Godrummy Castle, which was then taken, including his wife and including his brother, who was murdered. His other brother, Nigel, was then murdered. He then escaped to Northern Ireland. When they came back to Arran and then to Ayrshire, his other two brothers were captured and then killed in Carlisle, and he only had a few followers. And it was that time when there was no hope and the cause was lost, when Douglas asked for two of Bruce's men to take his castle, Castle Douglas, which was only 50 miles away, and Bruce allowed him 2 men. And when he came down to Douglasdale, he met up with one of the most loyal servants to his father, who cried when he saw him and immediately offered his services along with his son. And they met up with a few other loyal to the Douglas clan. And it was on Palm Sunday, where the garrison had left and they had gone to the church. And it was at that time when they went into the church, and suddenly they heard the blood-curdling screams of the war cry, "At Douglas, at Douglas," as they took out their arms and charged the English. And there they slain most of the English in the church, and taking the rest back to Castle Douglas, where a huge feast had been prepared. And then they beheaded the rest of the English and took them to the larder and put all the wine, food, supplies and wood, the bodies on top, and lit it on fire as they burnt down the rest of the castle. And this was known as the Douglas larder. He then returned to Bruce's cause with more loyal Douglas followers, but the word of this transpired across the rest of Scotland. And that's when people realised the campaign isn't lost, Bruce is here. They're taking their castles back, and more people came over towards Bruce. But that was the turning point of the campaign. And had it not been for that particular time, we might not have had Robert the Bruce as king and won the wars of independence. Scotland would almost certainly still be in English rule had it not been for James of Douglas and working hand in hand with Robert the Bruce and taking back his castle, but taking back multiple castles: Roxburgh Castle, Berwick Castle, Castle. Well, I'll go into Roxburgh's one. That's a great story, actually. So that's where he gets all his men to wear black cloaks. Actually, I'll mention it now.
Yeah.
So Roxburgh Castle was seen as the most impregnable castle in Scotland. Or was it? Until James of Douglas came, and he told all his men to put black cloaks on over their armour and crawl on their hands and knees as they got closer and closer to the castle. In the dark night, they looked like cattle, and their eyes, the guards, saw them, but they got closer and closer. And this is the first rope ladder that anyone had designed was designed by James Douglas. And he flipped it over the wall and then ran up, and they just heard the cry, "A Douglas, a Douglas." And this happened on Shrove Tuesday. And so the men were eating and drinking at the time before Lent. And before they knew what happened, the entire castle had been taken and burned to the ground. We feel very proud of what James Douglas did, and because of what he did, for 130 years after, the Douglas clan became the most powerful clan in Scotland, fighting enormous armies from the English, allowed the Douglas clan to be one of the most powerful clans in Scotland. And he was feared by the English, so much so, probably to a level much greater than any of the Viking raiders, that they had a saying in England, and it was "Hush ye, hush ye, and the Black Douglas won't get ye." And that's what mothers used to say to their babies to get them to sleep. So James Douglas changed the course of history, not just for Scotland, but for England too. Because after Bannockburn, he defeated the English 4 times with armies the same size or greater than what was at Bannockburn, and he defeated them in England, which was then the reason for Edward then being impaled by a red-hot poker. And Edward III then, when he tried one battle against James of Douglas and was defeated, a year later, Queen Isabella sued for a peace, and that's what gave Scotland the independence. So Tiber is very well known in the family. That was the last battle of James Douglas. He had fought 57 battles, of which he had won, and this was his last battle. And it was his most important because he was the most trusted companion of Robert the Bruce to take his heart to the Holy Land, to then place it on the altar in Jerusalem. And it was during that battle in Spain where he charged forward to protect William Sinclair, who got too far in front. And during that time, he was too far in front of the rest of the army and was unfortunately killed. And because of that, our coat of arms used to just be the 3 stars on the top, and then it was after that the heart, the bloody heart of Bruce with a crown. In our family, it was very well known where it was very well known about the Battle of Tiber and the last place of James Douglas, the last battle he fought. But I knew that Douglas went out there, and my great uncle Geordie, but I didn't know. And I know they delivered that stone, but I didn't know much else about that. I don't know why they decided to go. So it was my great uncle Geordie and first cousin, once removed, who took the stone, the memorial stone, out to Tiber. James Douglas was a very important figure within our family's history, and also within Scotland's history, and within British history as well. He was widely known all over Europe. Bannockburn was a huge success, and it was a battle won decisively. However, it was not the end of the war. In fact, Scotland only got its independence 14 years later, after James Douglas took Berwick-upon-Tweed. So after James Douglas took Berwick-upon-Tweed, an English army was sent up to defeat the Scots, and they waited up outside Berwick-upon-Tweed with an army of over 20,000. And so James Douglas took his Scottish army all the way down to York in this huge diversion. And Queen Isabella was staying there at the time. And they were so surprised because they had the English army up at Berwick, and they'd outmaneuvered them and come all the way down to York. And they won a battle called the Battle of Myton. And during that time, when the news came back to Berwick, the entire English army disbanded. One came down the east of the country, the other down the west of the country, trying to capture them. And Douglas, after Merton, went straight up the middle back up to Scotland. So he stopped in Spain because he was making his way to Jerusalem, and he was asked by the king if he could support him because he had, I think, 33,000 Moors at the time, and they needed extra help. And he willingly agreed to fight, not expecting this to be his last battle. But because of William Sinclair getting ahead of himself, he went forward and tried to rescue his friend. And during that time, they got too far in front of the main army from Spain, and they were cut down and killed. He was travelling by boat down to Jerusalem, and it was in Seville that he stopped. Hush ye, and the Black Douglas won't get ye. The fear that the Viking raiders had put into the English many centuries before, James de Douglas had put that fear into the English. But then in Scotland, they knew the true man, who was actually a very reserved man, a very kind man. And in Scotland, he was known as the good Sir James, whereas England, he was known as the Black Douglas. So without James de Douglas, Scotland would probably still be under English rule. They only won their independence back then because of James de Douglas fighting with Robert the Bruce. And Bruce trusted him so much, he let Douglas win the wars in the south and fight the battles of the south as he confronted his enemies in the north and the MacDowells in the kind of Perthshire region. Before each battle, he would remember what happened to his father, who was the first noble who'd joined William Wallace, and many more came to his cause. And he was at Berwick upon Tweed when Berwick was surrounded by Longshanks, and everyone in the town was brutally murdered. The killing went on for days, and it only stopped when he saw one lady with a wound being cut open and a baby's head being knocked off the ground, that he decided enough was enough. The father was then taken to the Tower of London, where he was murdered. And before every battle, he would think about his father and think about how he was murdered. And that's what drove him into such a psychotic rage that he was absolutely unstoppable in battle. James Douglas never risked the lives of his men, and his tactic was that of surprise and psychological warfare. Some of his battles he fought, not a single one from his side died, and it was usually using surprise. But whenever he saw a friend in trouble, he would help that friend. And this happened when he thought that Murray's line was going to break at Bannockburn. He wanted to rush over. And this is the same thing that happened in Tiber. And he saw his friend get too far in front, William Sinclair, and he charged ferociously, shouting at Douglas, to try and save him. But he came too far away from the main Spanish advance. And it was during that time that he was cut down and killed while throwing the heart as far as he could. It was to help his friend, yes. He was, and I'll say, if James Douglas hadn't died at Tiber, if he was spared a very difficult time later on, because, actually I'll say something else. James Douglas was so feared by the English. Edward III, hours after hearing the news of James Douglas's death, had decided to wage another campaign of war against Scotland, and months later they went to attack Berwick again. James Douglas was very loyal and a very kind man. He never risked the lives unnecessary of his men, and he'd always go to protect his fellow man whenever he got into trouble. And this is what happened at Tiber. When William Sinclair got too far front, he went to save him, but he took a decision too far. And in the past it had worked out, but this time his luck was to run out.
Some
The most important aspect of James Douglas was taking back this castle, because this came at a time when all hope was lost. Bruce's campaign had been going disastrously. 3 of his brothers had been killed. His wife had been captured. He'd lost almost all his followers that remained in Scotland. And he left Bruce with just a handful of men, and he was allowed to take 2 of his loyal supporters to take back Douglas Castle, where the garrison was. So Dad told me the story about James Douglas. The first time I heard about what James Douglas did came from my father. And I couldn't believe that this man had done so much. It wasn't just 1 or 2 or 3 battles. He had won 57 battles, with every one being outnumbered. One of those battles, he was outnumbered 50-1. So he had 200 soldiers against 10,000 English. And he knew Robert the Bruce was out of the country. He was fighting a campaign for his brother in Ireland. So were his most loyal war chiefs. And Douglas was there in the winter with just 200 men. 50 of them were soldiers, 150 were bowmen. And as he got news of a surprise English invasion, straight away he left, and he went through a pass in Jedburgh Forest where he waited for them, as the English army had come up in 2 parallels, and he attacked with ferocity the initial vanguard, killing their leader, the Knight of Richmond, and his bowmen had taken down an enormous amount of English soldiers. Once they had done this, they escaped into Jedburgh Forest, and they came and they found the other parallel, which had taken their fort, which they left completely empty. And still, on that same day, they arrived at the fort, charged in, and killed over a couple of hundred of the foragers, and dismembering and beheading most of them, and letting only 2 of them go. And then at the time, Annandale, who was the Earl of Annandale, who had led the campaign to take Jedburgh Forest and to cut down Jedburgh Forest and find Douglas, now believed there was an enormous Scottish army that they didn't realise was there. He had been defeated, and he turned around and left. So the Earl of Annandale left thinking there was an enormous Scottish army there that day, when in fact it was just 200 men of Douglas that defeated them, and they left back to England. For a long time, we were disappointed that very few people knew the story of James Douglas. So many people knew the story of William Wallace because of Braveheart, or they know the story of Robert the Bruce. But Bruce almost certainly could not have made it, and had won the kingdom for Scotland had it not been for James Douglas. The story of the Douglas clan wasn't all about James Douglas. The story started with his father, William the Hardy, who was the first noble to support William Wallace. It was enhanced by James Douglas, who was the most famous from the Douglas clan. But the Douglas chiefs after that, for 130 years, were absolutely ruthless war chiefs throughout the border regions, which were called the Marches. One of them was his son, illegitimate son, Archibald the Grim, who put the black back into Black Douglas. And he carried a sword that was over 6 feet long with one hand, and he would cut through almost anyone he came in contact with, and was made the guardian of Scotland and one of the most powerful men in Scotland. For generations after that, the Douglas family were known as a warring family to stop and check any English advance coming into Scotland. So my grandfather was the first man to fly over Mount Everest. There was a huge risk in going over Mount Everest at this time. It was in 1933, and an open cockpit biplane. Planes couldn't even go that high, and so they put an extra big propeller on, and they were taken down, because the air is so thin, they were taken down about 2,000 feet in seconds almost into a tailspin before they went up and only just cleared the summit of Mount Everest. And from the footage from that flight, it took 20 years later for Edmund Hillary to find a new route up Mount Everest, which is then called the Hillary Step. And I'm sure that he would have been inspired by what the Douglases, especially James Douglas, had done before. And likewise I was, before the 3 ocean rows we did from South America to Antarctica, Antarctica to South Orkney Islands, and Australia to Africa. I was very inspired by what Grandad did with his first flight over Everest and what James Douglas had done. And I realised that, not all things are impossible. Some things can be overcome. And through the rows, I've broken 15 Guinness World Records. 8 of those have been world firsts, so they'll remain in the record books forever. And that's the first row across Drake Passage, first row across the Southern Ocean to the continent of Antarctica, and across the Scotia Sea, as well as rowing from Australia to Africa. I was told I had 6 months left to live. It was about a leaking aortic valve, and it was only going to get worse unless I had immediate open heart surgery. And I only had 5 months of training from open heart surgery to doing our next row in Antarctica. Yes, I think adventure and challenging the status quo is part of the family. Certainly in what Grandad did and what I've tried to do with the ocean rowing. And it's what for centuries the Douglas clan did. So James Douglas, on his coat of arms, had a blank shield with the 3 stars on the top because of taking Bruce's heart to Tiber and fighting in that battle. The coat of arms is now the bloody heart of Bruce on the Douglas coat of arms. So what he did remains in history forever. It has a huge importance because Robert the Bruce wanted one of his most trusted knights to take his heart to Jerusalem and to have his heart laid in the altar. And he trusted James Douglas more than any other. This is the man he chose, who he considered as a brother, even though they weren't related. And he thought he was the most able to carry out this cause. 1, because he could rely on him, and 2, because he was the best fighter within Scotland. So it was customary in that time to not take bodies back, but to boil bodies and take the bones. But they also took James Douglas's heart, along with Bruce's heart, back to Scotland, where it remained in Edinburgh Castle until now. It is in Melrose Castle. And James has been buried in his kirk in Douglasdale. After James Douglas died in Tiber with his companions, it was seen that was the best thing to do, was to take his remains and his heart, along with Bruce's heart, back to Scotland. When James Douglas was sailing down towards Spain, he was treated as if he was a king. He had enormous crowds. People from all over Europe heard about the reputation of a Douglas. The English army at that time was considered the best, certainly in Europe, and a huge fighting force. The French were very scared of them. All over Europe they were known. And these guerrilla fighters from Scotland had challenged them and had defeated them on numerous occasions. Not just at Bannockburn, but on 4 other occasions with armies, the English armies bigger than at Bannockburn, and he defeated them in England, and Edward II was powerless to do anything. And this is what resulted in Edward II being murdered by having been impaled on a red-hot poker. His son, Edward III, challenged Douglas, and he took a huge army, instead of suing for peace, up to Stanthorpe. And at that time, he met the Douglas army. And each night, they would have these enormous bonfires and sound their horns in a war cry, expecting a night attack. Until night after night, they got used to these sounds. And then one night, they attacked with 500 horsemen, and they went through the English tents, cutting through them and killing over 300. James Douglas himself slashed the king's tent 3 times, and all he could hear was a blood-curdling sound. They celebrate the death of James Douglas, or the life of James Douglas, more than they do in Scotland. I couldn't believe that there's a run there called the Douglas Challenge and a day called the Douglas Day. We're very much looking forward to going to Tiber and doing the Douglas Challenge, and also seeing the Douglas Day and seeing what it means for people out there, because he's more well known in Tiber and Spain, it seems, than in large parts of Scotland, which is sad. People in Scotland remember Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, but he was a true hero of that time. The story is so incredible and unbelievable. If it was made into film, people would hardly believe it was true. So when all hope was lost and it looked like Bruce's cause was over, it was Douglas who left with two of Bruce's men to take the Douglas Castle, and from that point was a turning point of the Wars of Independence. And from that point on, more and more soldiers came towards Bruce's and Douglas's cause. And Douglas fought the campaign taking the castles in the south. Bruce fought the campaign taking the castles and fighting the battles in the north and the middle of Scotland. So the Douglas motto is jamais arrière, which means never behind. And they were the most ferocious fighters within the Scottish army. And they were feared all over. The Douglas clan was feared throughout the whole of northern England, right up throughout Scotland. And that's why they controlled the area in the borders of Scotland that was known as the Marches. And they controlled the forests, Selkirk Forest, Jedburgh Forest, the west and Dumfries and Galloway, and also to the East March. Every route into Scotland, they had to go through Douglas country and come into contact with the Douglas clan. So some can hardly believe that someone as ruthless and as psychotic in battle could be such a kind and caring man for everyone in Scotland and all his followers. He wasn't like that when he wasn't in battle, but before battle he would think about his father and think about what happened to him and how he was murdered. And this would turn him into a psychotic rage. And his eyes during battle were said to be like the eyes of demons, as he would charge in, shouting at Douglas and Douglas in unstoppable ferocity. And this spurred the rest of the men on that fought alongside him. James was loyal to Robert the Bruce right into the end. He was desperately sad by his death, and he'd given his word, and his word was his bond. And he was loyal to Bruce to the end, even if that meant death. And for James, there was nowhere better to die than in battle, and battle for Bruce. Bruce also knew that to protect his line and his children's line, he had to empower the Douglas family to make sure to keep his line safe. And that's why many of the lands in the south of Scotland were given to James the Douglas and the Douglas clan, because they were seen as the best fighters in Scotland, and that would be to protect Bruce's line. Wars ruined many noble families, but it made the House of Douglas. Within hours of Edward III realising that Douglas had been killed in Spain, he'd made the decision to wage war against Scotland. So we went back to Roxburgh Castle. Roxburgh Castle was seen as the most impregnable castle in Scotland. No one had ever taken it before. But this is before James the Douglas. And he had put together a new device that had never been used before, which was effectively the first rope ladders. And he made sure all his men wore black cloaks over their armour and from a long distance away crept forward on their hands and their knees to get closer to Roxburgh Castle at night. And the guards who were looking thought they were cattle, until they got closer and closer and put the rope ladder up the steep sides of the walls and then went up the castle. And this happened on Shrove Tuesday, and they took the entire castle by surprise, killing most, and the rest were allowed to leave as they burnt the castle, the impregnable fortress, to the ground. And this sent a shockwave across the rest of England. If they could lose Roxburgh Castle, they could lose every castle they had in Scotland. Before James Douglas, the Viking raiders were the most feared raiders that ever hit the shores of England. After James the Douglas excursions on a yearly basis as far down as York and the Humber, they were more terrified of the Douglases than they were of the Viking raiders. James was one of the greatest fighters, guerrilla fighters, certainly within Europe. I can't think of any other example that fought with such... James fought 57 battles that he won, each one being outnumbered, some of them up to 50-1, and he prevailed on every occasion. And on paper, the English army was the most powerful in Europe. They should have conquered Scotland and the armies so easily. And through different tactics and cunning, he managed to defeat them on every single occasion.